The final one of these, well, it depends which order you've chosen to view them in. The final one that I'm recording of these short series of talks about the Queensland chemistry syllabus is around assessment, what's different about it. And again, I'm assuming that you are quite comfortable with assessment in science education and are cognizant of the fact that we're assessing scientific knowledge, the concepts that students have developed. We're assessing thinking skills and habits of mind, so skills in that mental sense. We're assessing physical skills in practical process skills, doing labs, writing lab reports, a whole variety of skills that are required to do science. And I've got a question mark there on assessment of beliefs and attitudes. Are we assessing students' understanding of things, of issues? So I think I mentioned human cloning earlier. Are we assessing whether they understand that there are possible positions on that, or are we assessing them on a particular view? Because obviously there's a range of possible views on what we would do around that particular issue. I've kind of gone to a biology example. Climate change I've also mentioned. There are a range of possible views, and we're not going to mark them wrong if they disagree with our view on that particular issue. But what I mean really by attitudes and values more is an attitude of scientific integrity. So you don't, when you're in the lab, analyze the data and throw away any inconvenient points that don't fit your theory, for example. You don't fudge the results, you don't cheat, you don't steal someone else's data and use it yourself, and so on. So there are those kind of attitudes and values, and there's an attitude of valuing science, that I care about knowledge claims, how we make them, how we support them, how we share them, and so on. So those are the kinds of attitudes and values that I think we are looking at, and how we assess them might vary, and it's probably not going to be in the end of the year exam or the end of the unit test. It might be in a discussion that you observe, or it might be in a whole variety of other ways, asking them to do a presentation about some kind of issue and so on. I really like using self and peer assessment because it gets that metacognitive juices flowing. It gets the students thinking about thinking and learning about learning. It means that rather than attempting to please the lecturer, teacher, instructor, whoever's marking their work, because that's often their mindset is, how do I get a good mark by guessing what the person marking this is looking for and giving it to them? Well, that's not the attitude that's going to help them understand chemistry, help them understand chemistry or have a love for it, because they're just doing it to please someone else. They're jumping through hoops for the ringmaster. So what you want them to do is understand what constitutes a good performance for themselves and how they can improve their own performance. And they can do that by judging their own work. So this is your work. What grade do you think it deserves, and how do you justify that? Look at the criteria sheet, make an argument for why you deserve a particular grade. Or this is your peer's work. Check that out, suggest a grade, and tell me why you support that grade. Incidentally, we often think that if we do peer assessment, students will just give their mates good marks and their enemies bad marks. Turns out there's lots of research into this, and students are actually remarkably good at marking work actually on its merits. In other words, the correlation between the marks given by professional markers and by students is very high. So it's well worth doing some peer assessment and including it in your assessment bundle. A performance assessment is something that's specific to science, and you're probably doing it in junior science as well. This idea that you go into the lab and you have the students do a talk aloud protocol. My favorite example is a chemistry example. If someone's doing a titration and you get them to talk you through it aloud and say, now I'm taking the burette and I'm rinsing it with the solution that's going into the burette. I'm not rinsing it with water because I don't want to dilute what's in the burette. Now I'm taking the flask and I'm rinsing it with water because I don't want to add any concentration that I haven't included in the calculation of the solution that's going to go in there as an aliquot from the pipette. So in other words, if they can talk you through and tell you what they're doing and why they're doing it, that you can really test their understanding. Do they have the mental skills as well as the physical skills? Now, obviously that can be potentially time consuming. This is where some peer assessment comes in, or you might use video or audio or photos. But remember that if you take video, you have to mark it sometimes, and then you might spend all weekend doing that. It can be unbelievably time consuming. So that's a decision for you to make, what medium you use and how that works. But performance assessments are quite important because they assess that skills dimension. We've got the content knowledge, but we've got the skills dimension, and we need to be able to assess that. And it's one of the exit criteria. So we need to have evidence in relation to those skills. Performance assessments are one of those ways that we do it. I mentioned earlier in another video that we have different assessment types in the we have the 3 assessment types in chemistry. This is just a comparison across the senior secondary curricula, syllabuses, all of them have the EEI, the Extended Experimental Investigation, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think is fantastic. Chemistry and physics, as you'll see, are basically identical on this as well. The others are slightly different. The biologists call a supervised assessment a written task. The Science 21, which is the multi-strand science, has a bet both ways and calls it a supervised written assessment, so combining the biology and the chem physics one. Extended response task versus extended response. And in Science 21, they have a collection of work, a portfolio type thing that the students do, which is not in the other sciences. But so if you're looking at that chemistry column, there are the 3 types, which I already mentioned. Let's talk a little bit more about those in a second. But first, the exit criteria, which I also mentioned a second ago. These basically correspond to the strands, content, skills, and attitudes and values, but not directly, not perfectly. So knowledge and conceptual understanding, what do they know? Investigative processes, what can they do? And that, again, is both the thinking skills and the practical skills. And then evaluating and concluding. Can they make judgments? Can they actually think at a high level about scientific knowledge claims, about issues, about socio-scientific issues, make judgments and support them? So those are the 3 exit criteria, and they need to demonstrate achievement in relation to each of the 3. So an extended response task is an assignment-like thing, an essay, a report, an article. Actually, probably essay is the wrong word. That's more of a kind of English or humanities word, but a report or an article. Your ERTs assess all 3 exit criteria, so you need to think about how do I get those 3 criteria within the one task. And they're usually from secondary data. They're usually from web searches, library searches, newspaper searches. That's almost looking dated, isn't it? Because almost everything is web searches now in one way or another, or at least computer searches, because the libraries are electronic as well. But secondary sources appropriately cited, appropriately judged with the quality, so the students should be able to decide whether something is a reputable scientific site or not, and so on. The length requirements are, as for the EEI, which is 800 to 1,000 words for a Year 11 ERT and 1,000 to 1,500 words for a Year 12 ERT. There's this developing process with the students of the ability to do independent work, to do it with less scaffolding, and to do more of it, and do it at a deeper level. So that's quite an intentional development across the 2 years. Supervised assessments, exams or tests. There's a variety of different kinds that you could do. You could do a paragraph response. You could do an exit ticket. I've seen people do that, where you just have the students write half a page on what they've learned today in class before they go out of class. Supervised assessments can assess 1, 2, or 3 of the exit criteria. They're the only one that have that flexibility. Both EEIs and ERTs must address all 3. You might give them a newspaper article or a magazine article or an online discussion of a particular topic and ask them to make judgments about how credible it is, how scientifically interesting the claims are, and so on. You might give them some raw data. Frank Jenkins, again, my colleague, used to do what he called a dry lab, which is you don't take the students to the chemistry lab, but you hand them a table of data from an experiment and have them do all the steps of the experiment right up, other than actually doing the experiment. If you're trying to focus in on those skills of writing up, analysing data and so on, it can be a more specific, detailed thing than let's do an entire experiment and it's right up, because that obviously takes a lot of time. You do a lot of those as well, but you can actually focus in on particular pieces. And it can be anything from multi-choice, short answer, long answer, calculations, etc. type questions in essays. EEIs are a student planned, conducted and analysed experiment. The level of scaffolding, which I've got a point there on as well, but the level of scaffolding decreases from year 11 to year 12. So a year 11 EEI, you'll give them quite a lot of detail, helping them planning their instruction. You're developing that kind of understanding of what a scientific investigation is, how you control, and again, you're doing this in junior science. What's your dependent and independent variable, and what are your controlled variables? What are you actually trying to demonstrate? What knowledge claim do you want to make, and what evidence will you need to be able to make that claim plausibly? They use the primary data that they've created themselves. Your EEIs in year 11 and year 12 must be at least 4 weeks long. You can make them longer, and lots of people do 6 or 8 weeks. But remember that I said also that you don't learn new content usually in EEIs. So in some ways, making it longer reduces the time you've got for learning new content. So, but on the other hand, you want them to have enough time to do something rich, meaningful, deep. So I really also encourage teachers to not get students to spend weeks and weeks and weeks at school basically messing about, doing very little because they're working on their EEI, and then doing it in rush at the end, or doing it at home or whatever. Do the experiments at school where they have the apparatus and the safety and whatever else. Get them to take the data and go and write it at home, and try and keep a sense of forward momentum. So, because as I say, you often will go to a class to observe or do something like that, and everybody's really just lolling around chatting, but they're working on their EEI. So keeping that forward momentum going. EEI has to assess all 3 exit criteria, and these are the lengths. So for year 11 for monitoring, and for year 11 for year 12 for verification, that kind of length. Those times there are if they do a video or other presentation, that's considered to be roughly equivalent to a written piece of that kind of size. Now, I think those are really great assessment tasks to use, but at the same time, the moderation panel is not going to sit down and watch 20 videos, 20 10-minute videos. They simply don't have time. So probably not something that goes to panel, but something that can go in the folio and be asked for by panel, I guess. With those kind of things as well, I would suggest be careful about spending a huge amount of time with students learning the technology to make their presentation, and little time learning the content or demonstrating the content. Does that make sense? That there's always a learning curve, and there's a cost-benefit analysis. And if it takes them 3 weeks to learn to edit video, would that time have been better spent learning chemistry? What your criteria sheets should include. And really good criteria sheets are fantastic because they help the students understand it's not just guess what's in my head. This is very explicitly what constitutes a good performance. It's defensible for you. You can say, look, here are the criteria for my assessment. Other teachers who have to look at your work, either for moderation purposes or because they come in when you're sick or for whatever else, have a clear sense of what constitutes a performance as well, right? It's not just what's in your head for judging what's going on. So you should specify A to E standards. Be specific about what's required on this particular assessment task. So a criteria sheet shouldn't be generic for the whole 2 years. Every essay we use this same criteria sheet. It should be specific to the specific task that you're developed, so that it's detailed and clear enough. Clear descriptions of what it means to meet the B standard on this particular criterion, and enable others to make judgments, as I mentioned. There are requirements about what you must retain for each student in terms of a verification. Monitoring folio at the end of year 11 and verification folio in year 12, which is the same folio that follows them through for the 2 years. So those details are in the syllabus. I'll talk about them in a moment. what's required to be in the folio, need to have evidence of the exit criteria and multiple opportunities to fulfill those criteria. So it shouldn't be just everything is summative at the end of year 12. They should have multiple opportunities across the 2 years. And the information, the syllabus uses the word fullest and latest evidence. So the best possible time when the student demonstrated that, but it will be weighted more strongly if it's in the end of year 12 than if it's at the beginning of year 11, because they've had more time to develop. So it doesn't mean that you're weighting it with numbers and creating an average. That's not something that we do under this system. We're making judgments about the extent to which the students have met the criteria. But the latest evidence is more important in making that judgment than the earlier evidence, if that makes sense. Pieces in the verification folio for chemistry, you need to include your assessment tasks, so the actual instruments that they've been asked to respond to and the criteria sheets for those. At least one, but no more than 2 EEIs. So you are required to do one in year 11 and one in year 12, so you'll definitely have 2. You could do more EEIs if you can find the time and if you can maybe integrate it with some other work and so on, but only 2 can be included in the folio. At least 1 essay, supervised assessment, and at least 1 year 12 assessment task from your contextualized unit in year 12. So remember, again, you're required to do 1 contextualized unit in year 11 and 1 in year 12, and you need 1 assessment task from that contextualized year 12 unit. All of the criteria sheets and a profile for the student that shows their achievement across the 2 years. In addition to that, you're also required to have one more assessment task after the verification folio has gone off, because it doesn't go off obviously at the very, very end of year 12. There's other processes, so there'll be one more task that will go into the exit folio for the student that hasn't gone to the verification panel. And that ideally should give them one last opportunity to demonstrate the three exit criteria. So hopefully that's clear, but look into the syllabus in detail and look at the video resources on that particular site. I think I mentioned already that no, I didn't. I mentioned it to the physics group. I mentioned that on this site, there are a number of videos. QCAA has this bizarre habit of labeling videos as DVDs, whether they're on a DVD disc or whether they're on the web. So when it says get the DVD, it just means click on the link and watch this video on the web. So in case that's a little confusing, but there are some really nice videos there about not only what to do for senior assessment, but why we do it, how it's planned, how this particular quite interesting internally assessed Queensland syllabus is designed. So I'd strongly encourage you to spend some time looking at those.